by me, Andrew Broussard. Either you're watching this live on Twitch or you're watching the later uploaded video of it on YouTube. So, anywho, today I have a lot of free time, so I'm doing a few paintings, a few videos as the day progresses. I woke up to a post on one of the Facebook pages I'm on, Ron Ranson Disciples, and a gentleman, Steve Halberry, shared a video from YouTube of a time lapse of a fellow Sergei Kubatov, I believe, and I believe the channel was Enter Class. So it was a time lapse. It was about 2 or 3 minutes long. It was a wet and wet using a hake. It was a horizontal landscape with reflections. So a lot of wet and wet the paper, put in some reflections, then use some the rigger afterwards, after it dried, for some different finer tuning points. So I thought, I was inspired by that, and I figured I'd do a video following that technique and that thought. With this one, I'm gonna do a few deviations. I'm gonna do a kind of scene that I'm putting together in my head, and it's just gonna be based off of a picture that my friend Chris had posted last night when he was out cast netting for shrimp, or yesterday evening when he was out cast netting for shrimp. So it's gonna be inspired by that reflection and the sunset. So wet the paper. I'm gonna use my alizarin crimson, put a little hint of sky and color in there. We'll do a in his video he did a high horizon line, and we'll do that as well. So put that in there. Okay, so this is alizarin crimson. I find that dries very light, the alizarin, and we're going to do a lot of this wet and wet, so we'll get a nice soft diffusion. So our horizon line is going to be right about here, but in the video the gentleman put in the horizon line after he put in his tree line. So do this, switch it up, get a little bit of ultramarine. Whenever you wet the paper, if you do it clipped and it's not pre-stretched, it'll start buckling. You could just lift up the clip and push it out underneath. That's a technique that I learned from quite a few people. Joe Menza does it in his videos. David Usher does it in his. Steve Cronin does it in his. So it's very, very common to wet the paper completely, let it start stretching, buckling, absorbing the water, pick up the clip, lay it out flat. Just like I said in a previous video, you really want to avoid using, or I have to avoid using my fingers, because I'll lift up the paint in that spot, and I have a lot of oils on my hands from my beard oil and whatnot. Anyway, so I'm putting that in. Then gonna mix. Let's do light red, ultramarine. We'll go for that background purple. I don't remember the exact colors the gentleman used in his video. I know there was definitely a very thick raw sienna straight from the tube is what it looked like on one of them. So I'm going to go thick with this, and he had a very, it was time-lapsed, but he had a very like fast and loose approach with this. So as I put it in, I think from what I remember, he'd put strokes in top and bottom. Tree line, reflection. tree line reflection. And this will give you practice giving and making pleasing patterns. I created a pattern. We just have a diminishing size taking place. I believe his was kind of more centered here with a little speck right there. Anyway, so top and bottom for reflections. Now I got to be careful when you have really wet paper, and if it's not flat, you'll find that there's certain areas that it always likes to sort of sit into. Here in my case, you can see it starting to take place right there. So I'm going to try to flatten it out. Some more. And there. Okay. So next, I'm going to take some strong raw sienna. Switch up pattern. We'll do some pure burnt sienna, if I can find it. That one's been hiding on me a lot. There you go. Hiding on me over here. Let's pop some in there, straight top and bottom. Just putting it in, letting it diffuse. Okay. So we have those reflections taking place. We could put some, try to get some pure ultramarine. Since I have the burnt sienna on the brush still, it's going to make it more of a brown gray. Now everything's wet and diffused, so I'm going to switch it up from what he had done. Put a few different structures that'll diffuse. Add some variety. A big proponent of this style of painting, with this wet and wet, with the composition like that, I seem to recall that a lot of this would show up in Zoltan Szabo's book. There's at least like 5 to 10 books out there published by him, and he was very focused on experimenting and different wet and wet techniques. Okay, so I just mixed up some burnt umber and some ultramarine. Everything's still wet. I'm just gonna come across, put in horizon line. Okay. Now, like I said, everything's still wet, and I would like to, experiment and try different things. So I'm just putting in some vertical brush marks, some horizontal marks for variety. And the guy who did the video that I'm talking about is just absolute genius, where it just came out so perfect. Okay. Now if you want, and I'm not sure if he did this, we can scrape a little bit. In the last video, I believe somebody asked, why do we scrape? What's the point of scraping? So the point of scraping is this. The white of the paper can be there in numerous ways. You can leave that spot blank. You can put masking fluid on there so that no paint goes there. You can use the wax, but I think removing wax involves when the paper is dry, putting newspaper up on top and using an iron to melt the wax and lifting the wax out. Or you could tape off areas. You could also use then the fingernail, a palette knife, or a credit card or a razor to bring whites back as well. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. So I mainly utilize the scraping method, and I use it to give the illusion of tree trunks and different branches and whatnot. So when you scrape, you have to really get the timing down right with the wetness of the paper. See right here, I scraped and I removed the paint in that area, okay? But if I do somewhere that's super wet, okay, I don't have any super wet areas with it. But you see how on the edges, you might be able to see how it's getting dark right there? The paint will often try to flood back in, and you'll just be left with a black line or a scar. Now that, I just don't know how to get rid of, so you want to watch out for that. See some of those right there filled in, which could be desirable. You may want to have that. So I'm going to go across and put in a variety of these scrapes. It's really fun. You could potentially go overboard with it, but experiment and see how far you go with it. And I mean, if you go overboard with it, that's fine. Then you start realizing, okay, what do I need to adjust? What approach do I need to change? But this helps add to that horizontal movement of this picture, which is something that, who was it? I believe it was Whitney. Edgar Whitney? Ron Ranson had done a book on Edgar Whitney, and I think it was after he had passed away, and he had interviewed a lot of his former students. He was one of those gentlemen that would do demonstrations and whatnot, and have the week or a weekend class where people would go visit him, and some of those visitors, people taking the class, became famous artists with different approaches and whatnot. But they all remembered him very fondly, and they were able to recollect a lot of his teachings. One of his teachings, I believe, was to establish a horizontal or a vertical. You could have both, but I think one of them wanted to be more predominant. So here I'm having a predominant amount of these horizontal scrapings. Now before I had talked about scraping in regards to tree trunks. Here I'm doing this scraping for the reflection, the ripples of the water, the whites that you might see at times. Okay. Now that we have that, the paper is still a little wet. I would like to get a little bit more variety in color and experiment. So I'll get a little lemon yellow into my mud. Do that. Okay. Now while this is wet, take a little ultramarine, Hake, there we go. And here we have the more horizontals taking place. So being that blue is a cooler color and wants to recede, but you're going to have the reflection of the blue sky closer to you, I need to come up with ways to help that pop forward. So what I'm doing is just building up a heavier blue, using those horizontal lines, so thicker lines, can use a swoop motion on the sides. Let me try to get that to keep the viewer's eye in the paper and then try to avoid them from going off. Let's see. And if you want, take a paper towel and also get that in there as well. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is dry off the paper, and then I'm going to switch to the rigger. Okay, so in that video that I had mentioned earlier that this was all inspired by, the gentleman just had this amazing skill with the rigger where you want to approach it as calligraphy type strokes, and at the end he signs his name with the rigger. And I was just thinking, this guy must have a lot of experience with brush pens and brush calligraphy and those uses, because it was just amazing, his approaches. So this is to add variety and texture, as well as help create a little bit of depth back there. So these are going to be our trees and whatnot, and they're going to bring their reflection down. You don't have to bring the whole reflection down of every object. You can just give that idea of it. Now, with reflections, they often say that the reflections of lighter objects appear darker and darker objects appear lighter. So if you want, you can water down, tone down whatever you're mixing for this, for those reflections. I am not doing that right now. I'm just trying to stay loose with this brush and just get some fun and interesting patterns and emotion going on. I mixed Payne's Gray and Ultramarine Blue for this. Ultramarine Payne's Gray has a tendency to dry very lighter for me, and that's something I'll probably wind up saying in every dang video. So you can mix ultramarine and burnt sienna for burnt umber for darks. There's other combinations, but I'm just trying to keep it to a limited palette. All right. So not too much thought taking place, just more trying not to have stagnant, repetitive vertical lines. Trying to get in art, something like this, they'd call it an organic feeling, where you're looking for those verticals when you're getting that change in shape. And yes, there's tree trunks that grow straight up. There really are. We all see them, but it just wouldn't work in a painting like this. So you want to take artistic liberty and ask yourself, would these verticals work? Does it give it, like the tonalists? There was a tonalist painter, Eaton, I think. I'm not sure, but he was known as the painter of pine trees or the master of pine trees, something like that. And he had a lot of those vertical pine trees in it, and it just was amazing. So it really depends on the subject matter, the emotion, the feel that you're trying to convey, etc. whenever you're doing these. So that is that. I mean, you could take some pure raw sienna for some of these as well. Kind of get, just trying it out for variety. This is experimental. Heck, you could even, taking a large round, getting it wet, taking up that excess, keep it go across and splatter. So I'll do one more round of splattering. Then I need to draw my attention to the foreground, just because I personally have a hard time leaving all that empty space there. Okay, so we splattered some on it. Now what we'll do is, nope, grab the wrong hake. I mean, I could use any one, but I just don't want to have to wash both. Even though it only takes a few seconds, I just don't want to have to do that. Okay, so on a dryish hake, I may have overdone this. Okay. Now, this is something that I've done before. I'm going to do it again on this one, where I personally, for my own sanity, need some sort of foreground element right in here. So what I'm going to do is put in a big old branch from a tree coming out the water, you know, a dead branch, or maybe this area is flooded. Using the rigger to put a little bit of ripples and texture around it. Come down with its reflection. This is just the ultramarine and Payne's gray mixture. And let's just try to stay organic. And I'll switch over to a, let's see. The Titan Buff by Van Gogh brands, which is, I think, Royal Talons. That's what it's under. I'm going to put big old heron type bird. Heron, crane, whatever you prefer to call it. I mean, I'm sure there's obvious differences, and if there's any people that are really knowledgeable about. These type of animals. Feel free to correct me or just, you know, drop in the comments the difference. Okay, his reflection is going to be down here, or her reflection. To make things easy, just going to take a micron pen. Okay, I'm going to have to dry this off. It's still wet, so I'm just going to grab some more black, like, well, my dark mix. Just put my eye right in there. Coming out a little goofy. I'm not liking the way that's looking. Yeah, having a lot of difficulty with that guy today. Let's see. So we're pretty much at the end of the painting process for this video. We'll just leave it at that. Well, we could get a little burnt raw sienna. Put that right in there for his little feet. There we go. Now taking some of that white, just putting it back here. So besides scratching, you could also use what's called gouache, or which is the white, or you can use the Titan Buff, which I think is just using the same pigment. Maybe it's a little something else in it. Alright, so I'm going to sign this and call it a day. Hope you enjoyed watching. Hopefully you learned something. Leave feedbacks and comments. Feel free to check out the other videos and all that other good stuff. Alright, bye.